and thank you for joining me. Today I'm going to be exploring the possibility that Christ is our armour bearer. And this came about when I was doing a Bible study on armour. And as I was going through scriptures, I kept coming across references to armour bearers that made me think, gee, this is so much like Jesus. So I decided to do a little bit of side study from my armour and go into armour bearers. Now, the armour bearer was a loyal companion to an important warrior or king, and they were tasked with bearing the king's weapons as well as standing alongside them in times of danger. They needed to be experienced themselves in fighting. They had to be renowned as warriors themselves because the king wanted them to protect them and support them in battles. So they had to be experienced warriors, otherwise they wouldn't have been any good. So reading the accounts of Abimelech and Saul, Jonathan and David, we get an idea of some of the things that they did. Now, one of the things that they did most of the time was protecting honour. Now, Abimelech, this is brought out with the story of Abimelech when he gets donked on the head by a millstone that was conveniently dropped by a woman in battle. And he asks his armour bearer to run him through because, it's truth, you can't die at the hands of a woman. And this is brought out in Judges 9:54. Hurriedly he called to his armour bearer, "Draw your sword and kill me." So they can't say a woman killed him. So his servant ran him through and he died. Armour bearers were completely loyal. And this is brought out in the story of Jonathan and his armour bearer in 1 Samuel chapter 14. And Jonathan decided to attack the Philistines, one day as you do. And he informed his armour bearer that this is what he was going to do. So in verse 7 it says, "Do all that you have in mind," his armour bearer said. "Go ahead, I am with you, heart and soul." And then further on in verse 13, Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet with his armour bearer following him, right behind him. And the Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armour bearer followed and killed behind him. So I love this imagery because I just see two warriors fighting back to back with Jonathan in the front and the armour bearer at the back. And they were working as a tight team. The other aspect of an armour bearer was remaining. And this is brought out with David and Saul. David was chosen to become Saul's armour bearer and to remain in service. And this is brought out in 1 Samuel 16, verses 21 to 22. David came to Saul and entered his service. Saul liked him very much, and David became one of his armour bearers. Then Saul sent word to Jesse, saying, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am pleased with him." They served unto death, as illustrated in 1 Samuel 31. Saul was fatally injured, and he asked his armour bearer to kill him and finish him off. But the armour bearer was a bit terrified to kill the king. But when Saul fell on his sword, he fell on his as well. And in 1 Samuel 31:5, when the armour bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. And then finally we have the list of mighty warriors, 37 mighty warriors of King David, as detailed in 2 Samuel 23:37. And among those listed warriors was Naharai, who was an armour bearer to Joab. So this illustrates quite clearly that armour bearers weren't just chosen willy-nilly. They had to be established and recognised as a loyal warrior themselves, experienced in battle. But looking at these accounts, and there are more if you want to go further into it, you get some idea of the responsibilities of the armour bearer. They entered into service and remained, sometimes even unto death. They were brave, trustworthy, honourable, loyal and mighty. They served silently but diligently, with most not even being recognised. They're not even named, except Naharai. Their role was to strengthen the position of the king, to exalt and uplift with utmost respect and submission, and they kept watch when the king slept and acted to ensure the king was not ashamed in any way. They literally had the king's back. When I started looking at all of this evidence, I immediately thought of Christ. Because Jesus is always beside us, fighting for us and alongside us. He strengthens our position here on earth. He acts to ensure we are not shamed, and he watches over us day and night. And this is brought out beautifully in Psalm 121, verse 7 to 8. The Lord will keep you from all harm. He will watch over your life. The Lord will watch over your comings and your goings, both now and forevermore. So pursuing this thought, I discovered a verse in Psalms that actually describes Christ as an armour bearer. And it's in Psalm 35, particularly the verses 1 to 3. And in the New King James Version it says, "Plead my cause, O Lord, with those who strive with me. Fight against those who fight against me. Take hold of your shield and buckler and stand up for my help, and draw out the spear and stop those who pursue me. Say to my soul, I am your salvation." Now, looking at other versions of the same verse, some say buckler, some say armour. And it would be very easy, as I did, to just gloss over those words in that passage, assuming shield and buckler were basically the same. But they're not. And this is where it gets very interesting. Looking at the Hebrew for this particular passage, you find two very different words. One describing a small shield and the other word describing a large shield. And then to add even more to the intrigue, some versions mention two weapons. In the King James Version, it just said a spear. But in other versions, it says spear and a javelin. And the javelin actually means to stop those who pursue me. Now, the javelin back in biblical times resembled more an arrow rather than the javelin that we think of when we watch the Olympic Games. It was an arrow-sized small spear that you actually threw by hand, and quite often the king would have them in a quiver, and it was like basically throwing arrows. But with this weaponry, you have both defensive and offensive, and you have two distinct roles, because you see, one of the weaponry and defense is actually of the armour bearer, and the other is of a king. Now, the combination of a large shield while taking up a spear is often associated with the protective stance of an armour bearer. And this is brought out in 1 Samuel 17:7 with the battle of David and Goliath, and he had an armour bearer going before him with a large shield. Now, the small shield and javelin are generally associated with a warrior or king, such as Joshua and Saul. And if you look at the Bible passages relating to Saul and Joshua in battle, they were always carrying javelins. And this Psalm 35, therefore, appears to describe our Lord as both protector and attacker, both armour bearer and king or warrior. Now, the words shield and buckler do have a number of different Hebrew meanings depending on where they are in the Bible and depending on the context of the verse that you find them in. But in this instance, in Psalm 35, the Hebrew meaning for shield is magen, and the Hebrew for buckler is zinah. Now, a magen was a small, easily manoeuvred, usually round shield, often used in hand-to-hand combat. And this was often held by the king or the warrior for protection while they were holding the weapon in their right hand, or if they're left-handed, the other way around. Now the zinner, however, was a very large door-shaped wraparound shield that protected the entire body, a bit like what you see with the Roman soldiers, and you have a whole line of them and they're holding up this big door shield. Now the Hebrew meaning of zinner is menacing, cold and prickly, and it was this zinner that was often used by armour bearers in conjunction with a spear, and they were quite intimidating, very offensive. Offensive as in attacking, not offensive in the other sense of offence. But in this situation, you would have the armour bearer holding his zinner with his spear, and you would have the king with his smaller magen in his left hand and having his weapon of choice in his right hand. Now the thing is, when you are fighting and you have got your sword in one hand and the shield in the other to protect you, there's nothing on your right side to protect you. And this is where the armour bearer comes in, because the right side of the king is left vulnerable and unprotected. So the armour bearer's role was to constantly remain on the king's right hand side because it was unprotected, and he would hold up his zinner as a strong barrier between the king and his foe, and used the spear also to attack and the shield to protect. Again, this reminded me of Christ, because after all, who is always described as being on our right side? Let's have a look at a few Psalms. Psalm 16:8, I keep my eyes always on the Lord. With him at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Psalm 109:31, for he stands at the right hand of the needy to save their lives from those who would condemn them. Psalm 110:5, the Lord is at your right hand. He will crush kings on the day of his wrath. And Psalm 121:5, the Lord watches over you. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. So it's pretty obvious that Christ could very well be our armour bearer protecting our unprotected right-hand side. But you might be thinking, well, armour bearers were assigned to kings and warriors. I'm not really that. Am I? Yes, you are. You are his beloved. 1 Peter 2:9. But you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. And Psalm 8:4-6. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? Human beings that you care for them. You have made them a little lower than the angels and crowned them with glory and honour. You made them rulers over the works of your hands. You put everything under their feet. We are tasked with dominion, and we have the authority through Christ. We are his ambassadors, and as described by Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 5:20, we take up position to fight the spiritual realm. It makes sense, therefore, that Christ is by our right side protecting us and also fighting alongside us. Now, the position of armour bearer is an interesting one, because the position itself is actually lower than the king. The king is higher in ranking, which then poses a question: if we see Christ as an armour bearer, does this then demean his authority, his kingship, his rule? I don't think so. Both his characteristics of servant and king, lamb and lion are displayed through the role of the armour bearer. He serves us through his submission to willingly die for us on the cross. But he also rules by defending his honour through the defence of our honour. As kings and ambassadors of Christ, we represent him here on earth. Therefore, if our honour is compromised and attacked, so is his. When we call out to Christ to defend and protect us, he does so from the stance of restoring honour to the kingdom as a whole. So in this situation, he's king. Therefore, in Psalm 35, when we cry out to the Lord to intervene and return honour in the battle, he takes up both the defensive and offensive weaponry to protect us and also bring shame to the aggressors. But how does all of this fit with our Christian armour as described by Paul in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 10 to 20? We are instructed by Paul to put on the full armour of God. And I'm left wondering, when I take into all this information about the armour bearer and the correlation between armour bearers and Christ, I'm left wondering if the concept of fighting the powers and principalities of darkness in full armour also includes an armour bearer. Full armour. What is that? Does that include that back-to-back fighting? Does a full armour include an armour bearer to boot? I have to admit, I've always personally struggled with this particular passage regarding putting on the full armour of God, because it implies it's solely my responsibility to win. And if I lose against the powers and principalities of darkness and things go wrong, there's a sense that it's my fault because I hadn't put my armour on, I hadn't done it properly. Yes, God has given us the tools to fight, but do we actually do this alone, relying on our own strength and our own shield of faith and our own armour? Or do we fight with Christ by our side, a bit like Jonathan and his armour bearer, back to back as a tight team? Examining this particular Ephesians passage, I'm drawn to verse 16. Above all, taking the shield of faith, with which you are able to quench all the fiery darts of the wicked one. In this passage, the Greek word for shield is thureos, meaning a large door-shaped shield, which basically is the same as a zinner, the shield held by the armour bearer. Again, this got me thinking, could it be possible that taking up the shield of faith is not so much of us taking up a shield fashioned by our own faith works, but more of taking up the shield of faith that Christ fashioned on the cross? Is this thureos shield Christ himself as our armour bearer, simultaneously protecting us and fighting alongside us, ensuring that we are not alone in the battle? This certainly takes the pressure off us to perform, to show others that we've got it all together, that we've put on our armour, we've got our own shield of faith. Could Paul actually have meant this shield of faith is to be taken up with the understanding that this shield of faith is actually Christ, our armour bearer, and not us? That our task is to believe by faith Christ stands at our right side in the battle with his blood-soaked thureos, protecting us from the fiery darts of the wicked one, while we are in front fighting with our sword, which is the word of God, and moving forward on the feet that bring good news. Now, further to this point, verse 14 states, "Stand therefore, having girded your waist with truth." Now, we know that Christ is the truth because he's the Word. And in Psalm 91 verse 4, it states, "His truth shall be your shield and buckler." Now, looking at the Hebrew in this particular passage, there's a slight difference. This time, shield is actually zina, which is the large shield, and the other word for buckler is soke raw, which means something surrounding the person. So in this psalm, his truth, which we all know is Jesus, is described as a large shield that surrounds you. Therefore, when you gird your waist with truth, you are securing your stance with the large, all-surrounding shield, the thuios, the zina of Christ, who is your faithful unto death armour-bearer, who never slumbers, who never sleeps, who watches over you day and night, who is passionate about your honour and always protects your back. Maybe this is what Ephesians 6:10 really means. Finally, my brethren, be strong in the Lord and in the power of his might.
Thank you for watching. If this message has encouraged you or even challenged you, you are welcome to leave a comment, and please remember to subscribe.